When we talk about reproduction, we want to keep a few things in mind. Reproduction can mean cellular reproduction, or it can mean organism and therefore population reproduction. If you're a unicellular organism, reproducing a cell is reproducing your organism and adding to your population. If you're a multicellular organism like a plant, you usually have two different modes of reproducing. Mitosis is mainly going to be used by plants to grow or to heal. That's really the goal, the use of mitosis in a multicellular organism. When we look at reproducing an organism to add to the population number, we are going to see either asexual vegetative propagation, and sometimes you can call it budding. We do be careful with the word budding because we don't mean a flower bud. We mean making a little mini-me. So we looked actually at this plant in real life that creates little copies of itself, complete with new roots, that will fall off and grow new plants. The idea with asexual, remember, means you only need one source of DNA. And it also means that your offspring are identical. And there are advantages and disadvantages to that. It's very quick, you don't need to find a mate, but you're not going to have very much variation in your population. And in order for a population to be stable in a dynamic environment, which we know that Earth is a dynamic environment. In order for your population to be secure and stable, you need genetic variation. So the main way that we get genetic variation, if you think back, is through sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction is where you have two sources of DNA. Well, how on earth do you take DNA from two organisms and put it together to make a new organism? That's sexual reproduction, and that's why we need meiosis. So meiosis is not sexual reproduction. Meiosis is the production of gametes. And you want to take this time and go back and review what a gamete is. You want to think about a haploid cell. You want to think about varied gametes, the fact that we have crossing over, independent assortment, non-disjunction, sometimes there are mistakes. And so when we think about meiosis and the stages and the cell cycle that affects both of these, this is a really good time to go back and look at this unit where we learned these. But what we're looking at now is how a plant uses these to create an entirely new organism to add to the population. Because meiosis will produce a gamete. And so if we look at that with an example of a plant, now you don't have to know micro and mega gametophyte anymore, but what you would want to be able to do is recognize this gameto. Now gametophytes will actually produce gametes. They are not the gamete, but they will produce the gamete. And you don't have to memorize that anymore. What they're likely going to do is give you some sort of diagram or explanation and ask you to kind of identify why the parts of the cycle are so important. If you remember us talking about alternation of generations, going back and forth between haploid and diploid. And so you should be able to look at a diagram and see N and know that that's haploid, see 2N and know that that's diploid, and you should be able to analyze how did we get to haploid. Why is haploid important? How did we get to diploid? Why is diploid important? And why is it not enough to just be one diploid cell? How do we then get to be many diploid cells? So in this diagram, you have a gametophyte that's going to produce gametes. Those gametes, like sperm and egg, are going to fuse together to produce a new organism. There's a lot going on in this diagram that you don't necessarily need to know or memorize, as much as you should be able to look at the diagram of alternation of generations and explain the what and the how. What we see is this big idea that plants are going to produce gametes. Some plants produce both gametes are produced on the same plant. So in animals, we see that as a hermaphrodite, like in earthworms, how they're able to produce both sperm and egg, but they never self-fertilize. They always are going to release that and allow another organism's gametes to join in fertilization. And so some plants are going to produce the same, produce gametes on the same structure, and we'll see that with the flower below. Other plants basically have genders, a male plant and a female plant, one producing the sperm, one producing the egg. One of the interesting things is, how does the sperm and the egg get together? In animals, animals are motile. They can seek out a mate. So when a firefly flashes, or a peacock, male peacock opens its feathers, or a cricket sings a song, they are calling for a mate. They're trying to attract a mate. And this is, of course, really interesting to think back to in terms of natural selection. What helps you better attract a mate? What helps you keep that mate? What helps your reproduction be successful? And so what we see are adaptations, genetic traits that have evolved through mutations, random mutations, that somehow build on each other to create structures that help plants better reproduce. One of the biggest things we'll see is a flower. This is one of the most highly evolved and complex structures for reproduction. So keep in mind, for plants, all plants sexually reproduce at some point during their life cycle. When we talked about mosses and ferns, they still rely on water. When we get on land, we see that angiosperms and gymnosperms will release pollen somehow. Now, for angiosperms, if you notice, here's how I remember it. Angie is a girl's name. Girls like flowers. So angiosperms are the plants that are going to make flowers. And we're going to see a huge variety in the types of flowers. And we should actually be able to start to make some connections between why we would see variety in flowers. One of the first things that we want to talk about is, where does a flower come from? And before we talk about environmental pathways, just take a look at the structure of a flower. It's pretty complex, and you'll notice that even though there's a little bit of green, most flowers are brightly colored. They want to attract that pollinator. And attracting the pollinator is going to require producing something that is not green. We don't want it to blend in with the leaves. We want it to attract the pollinator to that region. So it's going to be brightly colored. So this is a huge investment of energy and materials for something that doesn't do photosynthesis. It's not about helping you build your body. It's about helping you reproduce. So a lot of energy put into making this structure, a structure that will not last forever. So if we're thinking about how much energy and investment of materials it takes to build a flower, it would make sense that the most successful flowers are those that actually use pathways or signals for when to produce the flower. Now keep in mind, flowers are trying to attract a pollinator. Because plants can't move to find a mate, how will the sperm get to the egg? Well, gymnosperms are just going to release a ton of pollen and but the goal being that it lands on its same species. Well, an angiosperm has actually evolved through random mutations slightly better ways. Keep in mind that animals are out all over plants all the time. So for some grasses, for example, they have a tiny little flower. They may not depend on a pollinator like a bee, because ants might be walking across all the time. And anything that transfers the pollen onto the ovary, pollen being the male part, the ovary having the female part, anything that helps us transfer that pollen, that is a pollinator. So while we think of pollinators as bees,